Portfolio Composer, episode 157.
You're listening to the Portfolio Composer podcast with your host and coach Garrett Hope, where he teaches you what it takes to master the business end of writing music through mindset, marketing, and business skills. Make sure to sign up for the newsletter at theportfoliocomposer.com for exclusive offers, business insights, and information not shared on the podcast. And now, for this episode of the Portfolio Composer.
I think really the most important shift we can make is not thinking of being a parent as only something negative towards somebody's career as a composer, because of course, there's difficulties. You don't have as much time, you can't get out as much, but there's also amazing things, like you've been forced to really change your life perspective, change priorities. Often people have had some time out to think about things in larger, sort of in a larger perspective.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of The Portfolio Composer. I am your host, your coach, your teacher, Garrett Hope, and I'm so thankful that you're joining us today. As you know, if you've been listening to this podcast for any time at all, I really believe that composers are in a very unique place as we're still in the very beginning stages of the 21st century. We have tools and resources available to us that other generations did not have. And we also have the opportunity to create whatever career we want to create. And I believe strongly that composers need to build portfolio incomes, which means multiple streams of incomes, as well as consider what they're doing as small business owners. But a large part of what we do is, well, actually all that we do is interacting with the society at large. And that includes some of the really big problems and topics that we're wrestling with in our cultures. And I'm very happy today to have Emily Doolittle joining us to help us dig into one of these topics because things need to change. So welcome, Emily.
Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. I'm so excited to speak to you. I actually emailed Emily, for those of you who are listening, months ago after her new Music Box article came out, and I said, thank you for this. This is great. I would love to talk to you. And we're finally, it took some finagling, but we're finally together.
Yeah. Well, we've got a 6-hour time change to wrestle with, for one thing, on top of busy schedules. So
that's just the start, right? Yeah, and we both have our family lives.
Yes, exactly.
Canadian-born, Scotland-based composer Emily Doolittle's music has been described as eloquent and effective, masterful, and the piece that grabbed me by the heart. Doolittle has been commissioned by a wide variety of ensembles around the world and supported by organizations such as the Henriksen Foundation, Opera America, the Canada Council for the Arts, and the Fulbright Foundation, among others. Originally from Nova Scotia, Canada, Doolittle was educated at Dalhousie University, Indiana University, Koninklijk Conservatorium, and Princeton University. From 2008 to 2015, she was on the faculty of Cornish College of the Arts in Seattle. She now lives in Glasgow, Scotland, where she is an Athenaeum Research Fellow at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. Her chamber music CD, All Spring, performed by the Seattle Chamber Players and Friends, was released on the Composers Concordance label in 2015. Emily, I know from speaking to you and reading your bio in depth that one of your passions for music and what you're doing right now is the relationship between music and animal sounds. I think you said that's called biomusicology. Can you tell us more about that?
Some people call it biomusicology. Some people call it zoomusicology. Some people, look at it from a variety of different fields. But it's something I've been thinking about for about 20 years now. It actually started when I went to study in Amsterdam with Louis Andriessen. And shortly after I moved there, I heard this amazing bird singing outside my window. I didn't know at the time, but I found out later it was a European blackbird, which is famed for its beautiful song. And I was really amazed by the way short bits of what it sang sounded a lot like human music, but the entirety of what it sang didn't really sound at all like any human music I was familiar with. So I ended up writing a piece called Night Blackbird Song, in which I explored the difference between the way I thought a blackbird and human would arrange the same set of motives, which I transcribed from a blackbird that sang outside a friend's balcony. And at the time I thought, that'll be my bird piece, and then I'll move on to some new idea. But it actually ended up raising many more questions than it answered. And so the relationship between animal songs and human music is something I've been thinking about ever since then in a variety of different ways.
What are some of those questions?
Well, one of the questions that I ended up dealing with in my dissertation is the question of whether animal songs can actually be considered music in the same sense of human music. I mean, in the same sense of music as human music is. And so that's what I tried to answer in my dissertation. And I have to say that I went into that sort of with a mission to convince everybody that some animal songs should be considered music. But as I got farther into my work in that, I started to realize that there really is no one thing that music is. I don't think there's any way we could define music that would include all human music and exclude all animal song. And of course, different people have different things that are sort of the defining aspects of music for them. For me, one of the things that's really important is that it's to some extent learned or cultural. So the animal songs I've been most interested in looking at have been the songs of those animals that use vocal learning, which means they have to learn their song from other members of their species. So that includes about 4,000 species of songbirds. Interestingly, it doesn't include as many different species of mammals. Of course, it includes humans and whales and dolphins, some species of seals, bats, maybe elephants, but it's a much smaller number than the birds that learn their songs.
Oh, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. But, in the course of working on this, I came to feel like it doesn't really make sense to say animal songs are music or they aren't music, because it depends what you mean by music. If you're thinking of a sort of John Cagean definition that, anything you hear can be music in the right context, well, of course they are, but I actually think they're more similar to music than that, or more similar to a more restrictive definition of music than that, because animal songs are also created by living beings with minds that are putting their songs together in a way that makes sense to them and is intended to attract the interest of other members of their species. But I sort of stopped trying to tell people they should have other definitions of music that include animal songs. They can or they can't. But what I feel is really clear beyond a doubt is that there's a lot in common between human music and many animal songs. So it makes sense to think of them as the same kind of activity. And we can use sort of tools from music theory or ethnomusicology, music analysis to understand animal songs better. And we can also use biological tools to understand human music better.
I'm interested to know what some of these things that animal songs and human songs have in common that you just mentioned. Beyond what you had just listed, which means having to be learned from other members of their species and a few other characteristics. But can you go a little bit deeper into that?
Yeah, well, one thing, just beyond having to be learned from other members of their species, in many species of animals, they actually sing differently in different regions. So, for example, there's songbirds that in one area, they'll sing their song one way, and in another area, they'll sing it another way because of who they've been learning it from. So there's sort of just like in humans, of course, we learn, depending on where we grow up, we learn different kinds of music, depending on what's around us. Another thing that I think is relevant is that, I think the reason people may think of them as different is that we tend to talk about animal songs and human music in very different ways. We'll hear a bird singing and say, oh, it's just singing to attract a mate, or it's just singing to defend its territory, which of course, many times it is singing to do that. But there's also many times that, a bird is singing and it's really hard to tell whether it's doing one or the other of those things or something completely different. But the other thing I think we tend to discount is that when humans are making music, we may be doing it because we love it or, because we're creative or we enjoy the aesthetics of it, but there may be other things going on as well. For example, if somebody's playing at a concert, they might be, hoping to attract the interest of somebody in the audience. They might be getting paid. I think a really strong part of human music making is saying which social group we're part of. I think often people say, oh, I like classical music, or I like country music, or I like punk music. And of course, there's an aesthetic component to that. We hear it, and we just like that sound, maybe more than some other sound. But there's also saying, I'm part of this group of people and I'm not part of that group of people. In many species of animals, they also use the way they vocalize to show which groups they're part of and maybe their hierarchy within the group as well. And so I think it's a mistake. A mistake we sometimes make is thinking that if something is functional, it can't also be artistic or aesthetic. And if we're doing it for an artistic or aesthetic purpose, it can't also be functional. But I think it's really important to recognize that both of those things can work together. And of course, because we're observing animals from the outside, we don't know how they're feeling about it. It's easy to sort of impose only the objective things we can say about it on top of what they're doing. And if we're referring to our own music, because we're experiencing it directly as practitioners and listeners to that kind of music, it's easy to pay attention only to our aesthetic experience without looking at what biological functions it might be performing as well.
Yeah, this kind of regional difference between the songs within a species. Is it the difference of dialect or accent, or is it a whole different category, like completely different songs?
It depends a lot on the species. I think, one thing we often do as humans is refer to birds as if they're all one thing, but there's 4,000 different species of songbirds that each learn their own song, but they do it in different ways. So some songbirds, some species are, they need to learn their song, but they only are capable of learning their song. So if they don't hear it, they won't really learn to sing anything very well. Other species, like bullfinches, are so flexible that they can learn anything that they hear. So, it used to be very common to keep bullfinches as a pet. And as they were growing up, they didn't have it. People would take them when they were young, take them away from the adult bullfinches. They'd whistle whatever song they wanted to the bullfinch, and then the bullfinch would grow up using that as their song rather than something from their species. So you have sort of the whole range from song learning, just singing a very narrow window around their song, to species that are capable of singing almost anything.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And how are you using this to create your art?
Well, that's a great question. And, it has many answers. I've written maybe 10 pieces, maybe more, which have animal songs in them in various different ways. And I wouldn't say I use them in the same way in any pieces. Of course, I have some pieces which use them a little bit programmatically, where I'm not really trying to imitate any bird or any animal exactly. I'm just sort of trying to evoke, the idea of being in a particular part of nature. Other pieces where I'm really trying to, I never really tried to represent an animal song exactly, because if I wanted to do that, then I would just play a recording of the animal. But I think of some of my pieces as sort of translating an animal song into a medium in which it's easier for humans to hear and understand it, maybe in a way more like that animal does. For example, many bird songs are very high and very fast. And if we just listen to them, with our ear without slowing them down or something, they sound very high and twittering, but we're not able to hear all the intricacy of what they're singing. So in a number of my pieces, I've just sort of taken a bird song and slowed it down, translated it through an instrument that we might be more familiar listening to. And so it ends up not sounding exactly like the bird song because it's so much slower and so much lower. And birds tend to make a whole range of kinds of sounds, from continuous pitched sounds to trills and whistles and slides and, sort of broadband noises and all kinds of things. So I translate through those through sort of the abilities of whatever instrument I'm writing that piece for. There's evidence that birds process sounds much faster than we do. So I think if we bring them more into our sort of hearing range and our hearing tempo, then we have a better understanding of what the song is actually like for the bird. Another thing I've been doing over the past 10 years or so is collaborating with biologists, looking at bird songs from both a scientific and a musical perspective. So sort of using the various analytical tools from both fields to understand them better. And often when I look at a song, in that great detail, then it ends up showing up in my music as well. The two birds I've looked at recently are the hermit thrush, which we found the song actually follows the overtone series. And one of the interesting things about looking at animal songs is that, so of course, musicians listen to bird songs, scientists listen to bird songs. Musicians have been listening to and transcribing the hermit thrush song for, hundreds of years, and writing about it, but often in ways that really don't make sense. They'll say, it follows the major scale or the pentatonic scale. But of course, there's no reason that a bird would actually be following Western human music theory. There's various papers arguing that the hermit thrush song follows the pentatonic scale. But if you actually look at the song, it has many more than 5 notes in it, and they're not arranged in any pentatonic configuration. So I think those come from, an idea that people used to hold quite commonly, that bird song must be, in quotes, primitive form of human music, And so it must have the pentatonic scale. And then you'd see people trying to find it in there, even though it wasn't in the song at all. And then on the other side, you have scientists writing, modern scientists writing things like, well, the hermit thrush sings between 3,000 and 5,000 hertz with in a song of 2.5 seconds, and something which may be more accurate, but also doesn't really describe the feeling of this, the sound of the song at all. Mm-hmm. So when we listened to it, I started slowing the song down. And again, I find it fascinating that many ornithologists who study bird songs never really listen to the songs. They look at spectrograms, which provide visual representation of the songs, and they use analysis software. But there's things that you get from listening to it that you don't necessarily pick up just from looking at it. So I slowed down the song and listened to it and found that it actually follows the overtone series. So that was my first collaboration with scientists. We published a paper in that a couple of years ago. And then more recently, I've looked at musician wren song, which we found it tends to favor perfect intervals. And again, it's not thinking about them in the same way that a Western musician would, but the perfect intervals are based on the simplest integer ratios, 2 to 1, 3 to 2, 4 to 3. And for some reason, the bird has gravitated towards intervals based on those ratios as well. I don't know if it makes it easier for them to remember or easier for them to sing in tune, or perhaps they're hearing those ratios within a single sound, and then they're trying to sing them melodically as well. And right now I'm just beginning some research on gray seal vocalizations. I'm living in Scotland right now, mm-hmm. and there's a lot of folklore about gray seals singing. Maybe some of you have heard the Selkie legends, but there's like a very powerful and sometimes ambivalent relationship between humans and seals in Gaelic folklore. And, there's a Selkie legend about sort of seal people who, when they shed their skins, they can come ashore and be people, but then they put their skins on and go back to the ocean and are seals again. But they howl. They do these amazing howls, which most people here have heard, I think, because there's a number of places that are close enough to shore where the seals haul out. So it's like a huge pile of seals just sitting on a sandbank or an island or, the shore, howling, and they make these howls like like wolves. And they're just an amazing, haunting, and beautiful sound. And there's a lot of, traditional music, which is based on seal howls or which is intended for attracting seals. And the first time I lived in Scotland, I had a residency here at the Centre for Contemporary Arts in Glasgow in 2007, and I was here for 3 months. And I read about this folklore, and I was really fascinated to try it out. So I went to a place where seals howl out, and I tried singing, and it's true. They howl back, or if they're in the water, they come out of the water to listen. And I'm really curious about this sort of mutual relationship where I'm curious about the seals, but they're curious about me as well. And even though this phenomena of gray seals howling is really well known in folklore, it's never actually been studied scientifically. So I'm now collaborating with a scientist at St. Andrews University, Vincent Yannick, and one of his students, Alex Carroll, to record some to record some gray seal songs, and then we're going to be analyzing them and trying to understand not only the parameters of their howls, like what the durations are and the pitches are and the contours, but also what kind of behavior surrounds the singing. Because so far nobody even knows which seals are the ones howling. Is it all of them? Is it just seals of a certain age? Just seals of a certain sex? Nobody really knows. And it has been quite hard to study because as soon as you get too close to the seals, and they all jump into the water. So there's a lot of, I'm actually going out next Tuesday to do another recording session, and we'll be creeping out very quietly on a sandbank to get as close as we can without scaring them away, to get an audio recording and hopefully a video recording so we understand better what they're doing. And out of this, I'm going to be writing a piece, which will be performed by the St. Andrews University New Music Ensemble in the spring. And if we feel like we can understand better what the seals are actually doing, then hopefully we'll be writing a scientific paper as well.
That's wonderful. So
yeah, it's fun.
What has surprised you the most as you've been doing this research?
It's a good question. It's interesting. I feel like the terrain has sort of changed in the time I've been thinking about this. I first started thinking about animal songs in 1998, and I started writing a dissertation about whether some animal songs can be considered music in 2003. And people were thinking about that. There's a book by Francois Bernard Mache that was written in the 1980s called Music and Nature, which sort of introduces the word zoomusicology and is a fascinating book, which was really formative for me. And there's a Italian, Finnish semiotician and musicologist named Dario Martinelli, who had just written a book about animal songs and music as well. And I went to study with him in Finland for a couple of months. He was teaching a course at that time. But aside from that, there was very little being done on the relationship between animal songs and human music. I mean, of course, animal songs have appeared in human music as far back as we know. There's animal songs in medieval music. All the oral traditions have animal songs in them in various different ways. Mm-hmm. But in terms of, thinking about that study as a specific field rather than just a little side note in music or something, it's something people have been really thinking about consciously since Dario Martinelli started developing it as a field. But in the intervening 15 years, more and more people have become interested in the topic. I think partly because people are becoming aware of it as something they could think about, and it's really interesting. There's also obviously recording capabilities that people have now that we didn't have 50 or 100 years ago, so we can, it's easy for anybody to slow down bird songs. There's more and better underwater recordings. So I think as time goes on, we're using, it's funny because, one of the things that appeals to me about animal songs is just the direct connection of being outside and listening to, and in some cases interacting with an animal on a sort of one-to-one level. But at the same time, we often need to use technological tools to help us figure out what's going on better. Sure. So, for example, I guess, when people started recording humpback whales underwater in the 70s, it was an amazing revelation for everybody that they sing such complicated songs. But before that, nobody had really had the opportunity to hear them.
Right. Based on the content of your article that you published on New Music Box, have you experienced any of that kind of pressure while you're doing this research and art creation?
You mean the parent-related pressure?
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me just think about how to segue from one topic to the other. I feel like I've been very lucky in my career in that I feel like right now I'm actually able to do most of the things I want to, despite the fact that my time is more fragmented than it used to be. Well, so I was living in Seattle until 2 years ago. I was, on the faculty at Cornish College of the Arts, and it was a great place to be, but it was a very teaching-heavy position. And I had, ever since living in Scotland in 2007, I had really wanted to come back here. And so we finally had the opportunity 2 years ago, and I realized that if I really wanted to keep pursuing my research and composing the way I want to, I wouldn't be able to have a job which was so focused on teaching. So even though it was a big and frightening step, I quit that job. I was also 6 months pregnant. We moved to Scotland. We got settled in. I had the baby. When I was pregnant, I applied for a number of large grants. I had the baby. Then, I sort of recovered from that. I was just getting, ready to start composing and doing things again. I broke my ankle. I got a bunch of grant rejections. All of the big grants were turned down. I had a 4-month-old, a broken ankle. I couldn't walk. I was in a new place. I had quit my job. And I have to say, I felt very gloomy. And this is when I started applying for more things. And I started finding that, so many grants say you need to submit two pieces related to the topic at hand that have been written in the last 2 years. And, at that time, I had my new daughter, and I also had a 3-year-old. He's 4.5 now. So I had a very busy 2 years, including all the teaching. I had actually just finished a chamber opera, written a book chapter, finished my musician-written paper. So it wasn't like I had been being lazy, but I also didn't have 2 choral pieces that I had written in the past 2 years. So I felt quite gloomy, but I was able to follow advice that I've given to so many students and so many colleagues over the years that even if you're feeling gloomy, you still need to apply for things. Just because you've had 10 rejections in a row doesn't mean you'll get 10 more rejections in a row. So even though, pretty much every day I was asking my partner to say, please reassure me that just because I've had all these rejections doesn't mean my future is one of nothing but rejection.
Right.
And he was very good about that. So I applied for a whole bunch more things. And then, after having a streak of terrible luck, I had a streak of fantastic luck. I got the Opera America grant to stage my opera. I got some grants to do seal research. I got a number of commissions. And I also got my dream job. I just started a 4-year research fellowship at the Royal Conservatoire here in Glasgow. And one of the great things about being in the UK context is that here, composition is considered research. So whereas in the States, I was always sort of trying, I often took, when I was at Cornish, I was there for 7 years, and 3 times I took unpaid leave for a semester so I could go do my birdsong research. But here, composition is considered research. And of course, more traditional research is also considered research. And my job is to do research. So I have a much more seamless connection between my composition and my animal song research. So I'm actually really lucky to feel very supported in what I do right now. But a year ago, I was not feeling lucky. I was feeling a little bit despairing. And I recognize that it's only through having very supportive family and colleagues, having some money saved up so I could pay for a lot of babysitters, even though, it's not financially sustainable. Mm-hmm. But, my son is just starting school this year. My daughter will be starting preschool. So, I think I'll manage, but I recognize just how precarious it's been, even for somebody lucky like me. And I'm recognizing how many of my, female peers end up feeling pushed out. And then it gets, each year that passes that you're not really an active part of the composition community or the research community, and can get harder and harder to get back in. I think one of the things that's actually worked to my benefit, having moved to the UK, is that every mother gets a year of maternity leave here, and you're sort of allowed to discount that from your CV. So I feel like here, nobody's expecting that I should have been as productive during the 2 years, I had newborns, whereas in the States, nobody even gets time off, really. So, people are just saying, well, why weren't you doing anything that year, instead of recognizing that because you might be devoting your, many of your energies towards raising a child doesn't mean you've lost interest or are no longer relevant.
Mm-hmm. This seems to have been, or still is, a major problem within the new music and academic community.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, one of the things I found really heartening about my article is just the great response I've had from so many people. Many mothers wrote back to me and said how much it resonated with, what they've been experiencing. Of course, many of the same pressures happen to fathers or to people who've had other caregiving responsibilities as well.
Absolutely.
But I think it's sort of the double whammy of being a woman who's already somewhat marginalized in the new music world and certainly in the history of music, and then also being a parent, which both causes some practical difficulties, like you have less time, it's harder to go out in the evening, and so on, and also some stigma where there's sort of a cultural tendency to write mothers off as, just a mom, soccer mom, something your mom would like, sort of as nothing but a mom and as not having anything very interesting to offer. So I think it's really time we need to start speaking out against those stereotypes and looking at ways both to be more inclusive in the new music world and also not to write people off because they don't have the history or biography that we think they should have.
Before we go any further, can we just encapsulate this article? So for those of you who have not seen it yet, this is an article Emily wrote called Composing and Motherhood on the New Music Box website. And I'll put a link in the show notes. But take it from there, Emily. You kind of talk about this issue at length, right?
Yeah, right. So I was, and I wrote that article when I was sitting in bed with a broken ankle and a 4-month-old and couldn't leave the house and was feeling despairing about everything and trying to apply for these grants and seeing how many of them I wasn't eligible for because I didn't have my 2 choral pieces written in the last 2 years or whatever. I was also applying for, some Canada Council grants to professionals to pursue various projects. And those grants provide subsistence funding But the amount they allow for subsistence was actually only 2/3 of what I pay a babysitter per month to be able to do my work. And I think Creative Scotland, where I now live, the funding agency here, now actually allows you to include childcare expenses as something you can apply for. But the Canada Council doesn't. Most granting agencies still don't. So, I was just being aware of how much my being able to continue as a composer depends on me having some savings and a supportive partner and things like that. But everybody should have equal opportunity to continue as a composer. It shouldn't depend on previously having had a job where you were able to save something, or having relatives who were able to help you or something like that. So I ended up writing this article, and the thing is, certainly there's times when people are intentionally trying to keep women out of composition and intentionally trying to keep mothers and parents out of the new music world. But I think much more often we just keep doing things the same way we've always been doing them. And actually, when people are aware that there's problems, they may be very willing to change. So I ended up thinking about ways, the new music world can be more welcoming to mothers and to other people who've been excluded for a whole variety of reasons. Around that time, I went to the Tectonics Festival, which is a fantastic new music festival organized by Ilan Volkov, who's a conductor. And this festival takes place in Glasgow and Adelaide and New York and Reykjavik and a whole variety of cities. But I went to that, it was in April. Well, it's April or May every year. So I went last year and I took my baby with me. She was, 5 or 6 months. She was a very good music listener. So I just took her, strapped to me and went to hear concerts. And it's a very, those concerts sort of move from room to room, and it's very easy to come in and out. And I really appreciated that, it was very easy to sit at the back and hear one piece and not another piece. And some venues, it didn't matter if a baby was making noise. Others were, the pieces were very quiet, but it was easy to sneak out if necessary. And I really appreciated the flexibility that allowed me to attend that festival and hear lots of great new music. The baby actually enjoyed it quite a bit too. She was very interested in experimental sounds. And so that started, me thinking about things like venues and how concerts are organized and what we can do to make it so that people can attend, even if it's not possible for them to sit in the same seat in absolute silence from 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock on a Thursday evening or something. There's so many more ways we can access music and make it available. And, as I started thinking about ideas, just more and more of them kept coming. I had many ideas for grants.
Before we get into the kind of nuts and bolts of what we can do, which I want to get into, I want to tell you a little bit of a story. I think I might have mentioned this in email, but when I was at the New Music Gathering in May, we were discussing this, and I brought up your article, and I said, I'm contacting Emily. We're arranging a time to be on the podcast, and there was a tremendous response. And it wasn't just the women in the room who were interested in discussing this.
Yeah.
So it is something that's out there, but not being talked about. And then you just said you got a tremendous response, which tells me that this is a bigger issue than I think we're even aware of, or at least the males are aware of. And it's not just the females when I interview them, but anyone who is a parent. I'm interested in discussing life balance issues. How do you make it work when you're invested in a partner relationship and you're invested in raising other humans? It's hard. And I mean, composing is hard enough. Building a career is hard enough. And so there's so many issues here, Emily. Here's your question. Why have we not dealt with this before?
Well, that's a good question. I think until quite recently, men were generally much less involved with raising kids. So, they weren't aware of raising kids as something that, takes energy and input, and they had wives to do it, and women were not expected, it was expected that women couldn't be composers. I think, so there was just an expectation that the man would be the genius artist and would have a wife to take care of him. And I think it's probably simultaneously sort of increase in awareness of feminism. so many years of effort that have gotten us to the place where more women composers are being heard, even though it's, it's still not as equal as it could be. Plus, men becoming more aware of what it's like to raise children, as both as women are, refusing to have their needs be secondary to everybody else's. And also, I think as men are realizing that they've also been missing out if they only participate in their career and don't really participate in the family life. I don't think, it's funny because I don't think I was even aware of what an effect having kids would have on me till I had them, because I know before I had them, I thought, oh, well, I'll just continue my compositional life as usual. I will just have babysitters all the time and I'll go away, from the kids, even when they're tiny. And of course you can do that. And I don't, there's no particular balance of how much career versus how much family time anybody needs. I think it's different for each person. But, before having kids, I had thought, well, the only difficulty in going to an artist residency will be having somebody to stay with the kids, but they can stay with my husband or they can get a babysitter to help. And when my baby's 3 months old, I'll go off for a month. But of course I had my kids and I don't actually want to go away from them for a month. I'm looking forward to when I could go away for longer periods of time. But, I think that, both men and women are becoming more aware that a life that's all career or a life that's all family is probably not right for most people. And we're becoming more able to have the balances we want. But I'll have to say, one thing I find really encouraging is that, I've been a composer for 25 years now, and I've always been concerned about the lack of representation of women in composition. And I do feel like just in the last 5 years or so, I feel like things are finally changing. We're seeing many more women composers being programmed. And it's certainly not perfect yet, but things are moving in the right direction. But one thing I find really encouraging is that 25 years ago, I never heard men talking about it. If anything, they were saying, oh, well, if women composers were good enough, they'd be programmed, but they're not good enough. And now I hear so many men who are also really working to increase the visibility of women composers. And, it's not that people have to say, oh, yes, we need to include some women composers on the concert to be equal. I think that's a first step. But, so many male conductors and composers I know are really just finding women composers whose music they love and are really doing a lot to promote. And I'm feeling more optimistic about this than I ever have.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
I have a daughter and I'm 100% invested in her development and her future. And I don't want her future to be hampered no matter what she chooses to do, whether that's music or anything else.
Yeah.
So I feel like I have a personal invested interest in this.
Yeah, that's great.
And like I said before, it's a really big and pervasive topic. And we are seeing the rewards of, second wave feminism that's saying, wait a second.
Yeah.
This is crazy. I've also been in academia, Emily, and I've seen how mothers, it's harder, right? Like you can delay your tenure track clock often. Again, that's in preference to the male, though they're trying to be equal. But if a man takes a delayed clock, it's a little bit easier. But so many don't get the tenure simply because there was that interruption of motherhood.
Yeah. Right. And I read something recently about how when parents take a year off, say academic parents take a year off, if a woman takes a year off, for having a child, typically, the husband will still be, if they're a heterosexual couple, but if it is, then typically the man will continue working full-time and expect the mother to be doing all of the childcare and home care. So she's not going to be doing any career-related things. And then in some families, maybe the man also takes a year off or takes a year off instead. But typically, the mother is still doing lots of childcare and lots of house care things, and the man will be working a lot on his tenure portfolio, actually. So even though he'll be saying he's taking a year off, he's actually writing book chapters or, whatever. Mm-hmm. And so, often even well-intentioned ways of, saying either parent can take the year off results in the man getting farther ahead and the woman not.
So, I agree. And we need to find a better way to get equality, but it's an asymmetrical division because the labor is literally different.
Yeah, for sure. Yes.
And so I don't have the solution. I'm just curious as to how we can get there.
Yeah. Well, one thing, as I was thinking about, as I was writing my article, I wrote it, about being a mother and a composer, but really it applies to so many people in so many different ways. For example, somebody might get a slower start because they didn't have the educational background that led them to going into composition right away. Somebody might have to take time out for caring for a parent. They might have health problems. There's all kinds of reasons why somebody might have a different trajectory. They might be doing some other career first. And so, I feel like music and new music have tended to really reward young, the focus on prodigies or young composers. They've tended to reward people who are super prolific, newer music rather than music that's 5 years old and things like that. And I think if we can step away from valuing, new music, something being the newest piece rather than a piece that's a couple years old, somebody being the youngest composer rather than somebody who's new at composing, and step away from the idea that a composer who writes 6 pieces a year is better than a composer who writes 1 piece every 2 years. I think we can, start making room to hear music by somebody who started composing when they're 50 and writes a fantastic piece every 2 years or something like that. More doesn't mean better. Younger doesn't inherently mean better. Faster doesn't mean better. Written yesterday doesn't necessarily mean better than written 3 years ago, and so on. And I think once we stop having an expectation that a biography of a composer will look in a particular way, and the recorder keeps falling over, and start just looking at people and what they do and where they come from each individually, the more we'll find all kinds of interesting people doing all kinds of interesting things and stop erecting artificial barriers to people.
Right.
Yeah.
One of my favorite parts of your article was you concluded it with practical real-world applications that people can do. You talk to people who produce concerts, you talk to those who organize residencies, and then funding organizations. Can we talk about just to the composer community? So what are some things that we as composers can do to help change the problem?
That's a great question. I think the first thing is, as I say, letting go of this idealized biography of a composer. So if you're, say you're a composer and you're programming a concert and you're thinking, I want, 10 new pieces, and you notice that all of the new pieces are by, white men in their 30s or something, then look at how you can be branching out from that a little bit. Who doesn't fit your sort of search image of composer, and see how you can bring them in. I think one of the things, I really can't go to as many concerts right now as I used to be able to. I can't write music as fast as I used to be able to, but I really appreciate when people ask. I am writing a lot of music now, but not as much as I might if I didn't have other responsibilities. But I think it's great to keep asking people, even if you think they might have to say no, but let them decide if it's the time for them to take on that project or not. Let them decide if they want to be involved with organizing this concert or not. I think it's really important to think of alternate ways of presenting things. Like, as I mentioned, I really appreciated Tectonics because it was so easy to come and go with a kid. It would be nice if more concerts took place during the day or in non-traditional locations. I think really the most important shift we can make is not thinking of being a parent as only something negative towards somebody's career as a composer, because of course, there's difficulties. You don't have as much time, you can't get out as much, but there's also amazing things. Like, you've been forced to really change your life perspective, change priorities. Often people have had some time out to think about things in larger, sort of in a larger perspective. So, a year ago when I was sitting in bed with my broken ankle and my 4-month-old and not writing any music and not knowing what I was doing next, it really gave me a chance to think about what I have done and what I do want to do. There's a certain amount of chaos and unpredictability to raising babies and toddlers and preschoolers and probably all the other stages that I'll get to as well. But I think that becoming comfortable with uncertainty and chaos can be really important in music also, just sitting with ideas that we don't know where they're going to end up, trying things we don't think we can manage, just leaping in and trusting that we'll be able to figure out what to do as we're doing it, even if we've never done it before. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important to just start thinking about, parenthood and motherhood, and more generally, everybody's life experience is bringing different things to being a composer that could, really enrich our idea of what composition can be and what new music can be and what life as a musician can be.
I would like you to talk to the female composers who listen to this podcast, and there are many. And since this is a podcast about building a career in music, specifically composition, what advice could you give to those composers who are mothers and those who hope to one day be mothers on how they can continue to grow their career and have a fulfilling family life at the same time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the first advice is sort of to women composers generally, and comes out of my years teaching. And again, I'm generalizing, but some men fall into this and some women don't fall into this. But very often, I found that the female students were not very confident, and they let that get in the way of getting their work out there. And often I found that the male students were overly confident, and they let that get in the way of really being as introspective about their work as they should be. So I find myself often telling women students to get their work out there more, and male students to think about it before they, give it to somebody to perform. And, I was always telling the women students, it's not that they should become like the male students, but actually, self-criticism and introspection is important as a composer, and confidence to just do it anyway is important as a composer. And you always need to be balancing both of those things. I would say, I didn't have kids till I was 40, and part of it was because I was, I really liked my life as a composer, and I was worried about whether I'd be able to manage both. And I'm so glad I had kids. I was really lucky to be able to have them at 40 and 42. And so I would, I guess, I feel like a lot of people had told me, don't have kids unless you're really certain you want to. And I let all my sort of doubts about whether I could be an artist with children, prevent me from doing it for a long time. But I'm so glad I did. So I would say, if you're thinking about having kids, they're great. You should do it. Mm-hmm. It throws your life in chaos, but you'll manage somehow. Be very stubborn. You'll manage. For me, it's worked out well to speak up when I see things that are excluding people or unfair. So, I think it's important to do that and maybe find context where it is okay to speak up. If you're somewhere where, if you mention that you have kids, people will decide you're not interesting as a composer, then if at all possible, you should get away from that area. And the other advice that I think is really helpful is, if you're ever feeling in a rut or feeling like, gloomy like I was a year ago, like I would never have anything interesting to do again, just make yourself, send out 100 scores, apply for 100 things. I mean, I've never actually gotten up to 100, but if you set yourself a goal of 100 and then just keep doing it, things are going to start happening. And, I don't like the idea of composers as entrepreneurs. I've actually written an article also about why we shouldn't have to be entrepreneurs, but that doesn't mean you should sit at home waiting for people to, discover you. You need to make people aware of what you're doing. There's ensembles out there, performers out there looking for music to play, and your music might be just what they're looking for, but they're not going to know if you don't show them. So, in Canada, I'm lucky that there's lots of grants I can apply for. There's some in the States, some fantastic grants as well. And of course, some grants in Scotland too. But whatever country you're in, find all the grants that you can apply for, get familiar with their requirements. Whatever you do, don't apply once and get rejected and then never apply again. If you get rejected, and you almost certainly will get rejected the first time you apply, and probably the first 5 or 10 times you apply, seek feedback, make it better, do it again. I think probably one of the most important traits as a composer is just to be stubborn. And even if you don't feel stubborn, just keep doing it anyway. obviously people's finances really change what they can do. But if you're able to, I think it's really important to, put the money into having a babysitter or a daycare so that you actually have the time for your art that you need. I know people who could afford it, but they either have been pressured into feeling like, a mother should always be with their kids, so they can't leave their kids, or they feel like it would be too extravagant to spend money on babysitting, so they don't, and then they end up feeling really frustrated artistically. But you really need the time for yourself to create. And if you don't have the money, obviously it's really frustrating. Some countries have subsidized daycare, and really every country should. But I know people in the States are really working in the worst of circumstances because they don't have that. But, maybe you can do a trade with friends who, maybe you can watch kids one day, somebody else can watch them another day or something. But I think people sometimes glorify the self-sacrificing parent, and especially the self-sacrificing mother, but there's no reason to glorify that. Of course, you're going to do a lot for your kids, but you need to nourish yourself as well.
Yeah. This kind of actually ties in nicely with the question I was going to ask a moment ago, because you said that you were encouraging people to not be afraid to have the kids. They're great. And I've spoken with female composers, especially a generation or two older than ours, who felt that it just wasn't an option.
Yeah, no, I've heard people say that too.
And so if they wanted to have a career in music, they chose to not have kids. And I think what's great now, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think you can have both.
I think you can too. I mean, it's funny because people like to talk about, can women have it all or whatever? And I think that's sort of a dumb phrase because obviously nobody can have everything. And, one obvious way in which I can't have everything is I want to live in a quiet village for my whole life, and I constantly want to travel around the world, and I want to live in a city. I know I can't have all three of those things. And, I can't have as much time composing as I would like, and I can't have as much time with my family as I would like. And I can't, there's no way I can do everything I want as much as I would like to, because I want to be doing everything all the time. Mm-hmm. But I can have a good balance, and I actually feel really happy about, having a family and having, my music and having my research. And I think it is possible to balance things in a way that's as satisfying as possible, even if it's not possible to devote 100% of your time to 6 different things at the same time.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a good place for us to wrap up the conversation and head into the lightning round.
Great.
I'm very excited to announce that the Portfolio Composer has become a strategic partner with the American Composers Forum. What this means is that we are working together to build our composition community. If you have not heard of the American Composers Forum, you can find more at composersforum.org, but it is the largest composer-oriented organization in the United States that has many resources, programs, and grant opportunities designed to help you build your career and to create your art. The biggest benefit I have gotten out of being an ACF member is the curated composer opportunity list. This might be the most extensive list that you can find anywhere, with opportunities for calls for scores, grants, and performance opportunities. So I highly recommend joining this organization. Again, you can learn more at composersforum.org. And I also want to invite you to join the Portfolio Composer community by becoming a Patreon sponsor. By joining the community, you will have access to private webinars that I do for the Patreon communities and students of my course, and as well as private coachings, one-on-one sessions, and a few other bonuses. So please go to patreon.com/Portfolio Composer.
Welcome to the lightning round.
Okay, Emily, let's rewind the clock. What advice would you give to your 20-year-old self?
Oh, that's a good question. Don't worry so much. Just go for it. Don't worry so much. Probably about everything in life at that time.
Yeah, man, I could use that advice too. Yeah. What is a personal habit of yours that you feel leads to your success?
Stubbornness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How does just to follow up, how does that manifest in your life as a composer?
Not taking no for an answer. But I guess I don't mean that you have to make everything you think of happen. But if there's something that you really want to do, keep working till you find ways to do it. Sometimes that means changing your plans a little bit or going in directions that aren't expected. But don't just give up if you know something's important to you.
Emily, I don't even know what your instrument is. What is your instrument?
Oboe is my best instrument, though I haven't played for years, but I entered university as an oboe major. I play piano. I always compose at the piano, so that's what I play most often.
And so what is an instrument you have always wanted to learn to play, and why?
Well, this is a good question, and I'm actually learning it now. When I was about 30, I started playing fiddle because I wanted to play traditional music, and I'm truly a mediocre fiddle player, but I really love learning traditional music. I love playing fiddle. It's actually great being a learner on an instrument after, while being a professional in another area of music. So I hope it counts, even though I actually am learning it. It's super fun. I love just being able to participate in different kinds of musical culture and what a flexible instrument it is. I don't try to play classical violin at all, and I don't really have any interest in that. If I want to play classical music, I'll play oboe. But I really love just the tactile sense of playing fiddle tunes on the fiddle.
So have you joined in a ceilidh yet, or sat down at the local pub?
Well, once the kids are a little older, I'm planning to join a ceilidh band here. But when I was in Seattle, I played in a band which played French-Canadian traditional music. And when I was in Montreal, I played in a klezmer band, in that I played both fiddle and oboe.
Oh, that's awesome. I really like that. No one has ever said fiddle, so you got a new one.
Cool. Great.
What is one composition that had a profound impact on you, and why? I'm looking for the pieces that took your breath away or caused you to pull the car over because you couldn't listen while driving.
Yeah. So there's actually two pieces. It's a very, I have no doubt about this answer. The first one was Murray Shafer's Third String Quartet, which I heard at Scotia Festival of Music when I was 16. So that would have been, 1988 or something like that. And it was just an amazing performance of an amazing piece. It was one of those rare performances where afterwards, everybody just leapt to their feet. It was just, it really affected everybody profoundly. And I know, years later, I heard other people talking about that performance and that piece. So I know I wasn't the only one who had such a strong reaction to that. And on the basis of that, I became interested in learning more about Murray Shafer's work. He's a Canadian composer who every Canadian knows, but he's not so well known in the States. But he's really, fascinating as a thinker and as a musician. And he, one of his pieces is a sort of music theater piece that takes place in the wilderness in Ontario for a week every year. It's called "And Wolf Shall Inherit the Moon." And the participants actually camp out in the wilderness for a week. And Shafer has written the framework, but all the participants write different pieces of music and theater that feed into it. And the only audience is the participant. So there's nobody who goes there just to watch. Everybody's creating it and performing it, and also, an audience. So I participated in that for 11 years, and that really had a profound effect on how I think about music and the context in which I think music can take place. And, it certainly fed into my interest in music and sounds from the natural world.
Oh, that's great. Can you name a piece by a minority or female composer that you feel we should all listen to and know?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a little bit hard for me to say just because I think there's so many fantastic female and minority composers out there that I don't know who to choose. But the first three women composers that come to mind that I think you should all know better are Cassandra Miller, who's I see they're all Canadian. Cassandra Miller, who's a Canadian composer now living in the UK. Chiyoko Szlavnics, who's also a Canadian composer living in Germany. And Jocelyn Morelock, who's a Canadian composer in Vancouver. And these are three fantastic composers that I think you should know, but I could name, 50 other fantastic women and minority composers that I think you should know as well.
How do you spell the name of that second woman?
Chiyoko, Chiyoko, Szlavnics.
What is one book that you could recommend that could benefit the personal, creative, or business lives of the Portfolio Composer listeners?
Well, okay, I'm going to recommend a book that actually sort of I mentioned earlier in this talk. I don't think it'll benefit your business life, but it will certainly benefit your creative life, which Music, Myth, and Nature by the French composer Francois Bernard Mache. It's a fascinating book, and you should read it, even though it won't benefit your business life.
That's okay. That's only one aspect of who we are as individuals, right?
Yeah.
Where can people find you on the internet, and how can they get a hold of you?
EmilyDoolittle.com. There's a comments page, so you can email me through that. Yeah, or you can find me on my page at the Royal Conservatoire.
Awesome. I like to end the podcast by giving the guests the floor. So do you have any final words of advice or thoughts that you'd like to share with us?
I'm just trying to think the right thing. I mean, I would, like I said before, think of the things you want to do, figure out a way to do them. Don't let difficulties stop you. Be persistent. Obviously, always remain open to feedback, but keep finding ways to do the things that are most important to you.
I love it. Emily, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for speaking to me about this and helping me understand it better. I have a lot of growth I need to do, and I'm trying to take steps in the right direction. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is great to have the chance to talk with you.